Well, here we go.
Yes.
You set up recording.
Yeah, we have set up recording.
All right. Okay. So welcome to this talk/discussion on information precarity, being co-hosted by the Center for Publication Ethics, Savitribai, Pune University, and the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the University of Hyderabad Department of English. We are delighted to welcome today Dr. Rebecca Wilson, who teaches at the School of Information Studies, McGill University, Montreal, Canada. She works in the area principally of information behavior and practices, and looks at people living with the uncertainty, academics working on short-term contracts, basically vulnerable people, early career researchers and others. She is a member of the editorial board for the Journal of the Association of Information Science and Technology and has been guest editor for 2 special issues. She's a co-author of Looking for Information, its 5th edition, which appeared last year. Owen Stewart Robertson is a doctoral candidate at the School of Information Studies, McGill University. He has a degree in Information and Library Science from the University of Buffalo and a degree in Music in Performance from McGill. His interests include multiple domains: scientific knowledge production through sound, information practices, and the intersections of precarity and information practices. A little bit of an introduction. The UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, being hosted at the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad, is a teaching and research unit. We have had several lectures and symposia entirely online, and placed as OERs on the chair's website. We work closely with several people working in ecology, gender, poverty, economics, literary studies, a whole bunch of disciplines. And we have had previously Melissa Waller and Winifred Poster also speaking in and around the topic of information vulnerability. We are delighted today to be able to collaborate with Center for Publication Ethics, which is the only center of its kind in India, dealing with the thorny task of and domain of academic integrity. It's a domain in which nobody wants to actually set up a center or even work at, as I'm sure you know. So we are delighted to have you on with us, Rebecca and Owen, although we do understand that we are hustling you out of bed at unearthly hours. The time difference when we host these events is really a big problem. I would like to thank both of you for obliging us so readily when Shubha first reached out to you, including Shubha's thing of putting you through a trial run as though this was a film audition or something, for reasons I don't quite know, but Shubha does what Shubha wants. So yeah, I'm very grateful to the organizing committee at SPPU, including Professor Pange, who's here, my colleague and friend, faculty fellow in the UNESCO Chair of Vulnerable Studies, Professor Anna Kurian, and all the attendees. So how we'll do this is first Rebecca speaks, and then she can hand it over to Owen. If you want it as a discussion, that's entirely up to you. And then we'll have a Q&A, which will be moderated by Shubha. So welcome everyone to this session on information precarity and living with uncertainty in our day and age. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. It was so wonderful to have Shubha reach out, and we were so happy to be here. So we're going to do a PowerPoint presentation. We're going to talk about information precarity, and we're actually going to start with Owen discussing that. And then I'm actually going to talk about some of the empirical research that we've done and some of the findings around that. So I'll just get Owen to share the slides, and he'll begin, and then I'll follow up.
Great. And yes, thanks everyone for being here. And it's an honor to speak with you all today. I'm excited about our discussion afterwards. So I'll jump right in. As Rebecca mentioned, I'll speak a little bit about precarity and information precarity, sort of the conceptual background of that, and then we'll get into some more depth with the research that has involved those concepts. And just to jump into sort of the aims and intentions of this talk, we are thinking of these conceptions of precarity and information precarity in this context. As was mentioned, we're approaching it from an information point of view. So these are large concepts. Precarity has been talked about in many disciplines. So we're just trying to give you an idea of how we've looked at it and how we've brought it into our information research. So I'll discuss precarity as a concept and a subject in information studies research. And also, we'd like to sort of build from the limitations of our own perspective. So we've mostly involved information precarity discussions in research involving highly educated and still relatively privileged communities in Canada and in Australia. So we look forward to your feedback. So first off, as I mentioned, we're approaching this from an information perspective. Specifically, as was mentioned in our biographies, we're exploring this from an information practices perspective. So just a little background on that. For those of you that are maybe not familiar, information practices, which is rooted in studies of information seeking and use, has expanded to be sort of an umbrella term for a range of information activities, skills, and processes around how people experience, create, seek, use, and share information. Involves also, in current conceptions, the ways that interactions with information and the production of knowledge are shaped by power relations, positionalities, and various socio-technical situations. Another way of approaching this is to view information practices as understanding how practices and ways of knowing are embedded in sort of this complicated dynamic between the situations, information, and the construction of knowledge. And it allows for building understanding of what information counts in particular situations. So as I mentioned, precarity is a very broad concept. It's been discussed in many literatures, and I'll just sort of be touching on a few of those aspects of this concept today. So beyond, historically, perhaps the root of the precarity as a concept comes from studying situations of precarious employment. And this is frequently discussed, this term, which is a little bit less in vogue now, but talking about this class of workers called the precariat. So from understandings around precarious employment, these conversations around precarity have expanded into areas such as gender, sexuality, citizenship, climate migration, many others. And so looking at how it connects with information research, we're sort of looking at it in this broader way, focusing not only on employment situations. And in conceptualizing precarity, I've particularly was inspired by some of the work of the gender theorist and philosopher Judith Butler, and they discuss sort of precarity as rooted in a couple different concepts, and I'll touch on a few of those. But for them, precarity and precariousness are two intersecting concepts, and precariousness can be seen as sort of this broader existential concept. So precariousness as this aspect of all life, of finite life, this idea that there's a sort of shared vulnerability between all populations. And from that, precarity, as sort of discussed by Butler, can be seen as this politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing networks, social networks of support, and are differentially exposed to precariousness. So it can be seen as a heightening of levels of vulnerability or insecurity, or a heightening of that shared precariousness, or a sort of exposure of that shared precariousness. And so precarity, which is built on, particularly on Butler's theories of gender and performativity, is seen as or can be seen as a form of embodied performativity. So it expresses marginalization and how the lives are rendered less livable as a process involving enacting and embodying norms imposed by political and discursive structures. So it's not really a universalizing theory as much as a way of understanding how the nature and origins of marginalization, and from that finding ways to sort of subvert and challenge them. And perhaps in contrast to marginalization as a concept, precarity may be understood as something that can occur over long periods of time. It may be protracted, such as long histories of racism, but it also may be sudden, such as when a change in law suddenly restricts a group's rights, or a sudden health change that shifts someone into a condition of heightened precariousness or vulnerability. And situations of precarity in the performance of laws and customs in particular situations maybe is something that, especially for Butler, is something that can be perpetuated, and also a way to provide opportunities for subverting those same norms. So these norms that keep people within situations of precarity also, as Butler suggests, sort of highlight the weaknesses in those broader systems or structures. And that may offer an opportunity for understanding how even within those systems, there's a lot of individual and group agency, and there are ways to sort of challenge those broader structures and the systems that create precarity. So one more term I'll add to this. So we have precariousness and precarity. This is a lesser used one, but I find it interesting. Isabel Laurie, a political theorist, has talked about precarization. And precarization for Laurie gets to this idea that going beyond situations of precarity, contemporary society in its present state is organized around a sort of social insecurity. So there's this complicated balance of instability and assurance that's created and maintained through governments and various structures involving increasing amounts of precarious work, financial debts, and a general societal focus on individual agency and individual choices. So for Laurie, precarization is kind of an extension and normalization of precarity from specific marginalized groups to the general population. So this doesn't deny that there are continuing structural inequalities and marginalization for many, but simply to explain how through various economic and political structures, states of precarity become aspects of everyday lives of larger groups of population. And so precarization also perhaps highlights how precarity is not something that can exist out of wider structures, despite the isolation and marginalization that results. And I'll touch on this. Writer Lauren Berlant also writes about this kind of more everyday side of precarity. So Berlant notes an effective shift, as she mentions, in worker desires that plays into the structural insecurity. And I think this is something that comes up in our research, which Rebecca will talk about later, but there's this idea that the desires for freedom, for mobility, for quality of life, while working within systems that create precarity, are things that both induce the precarity and also perpetuate. So for instance, as will be talked about in academic work, sometimes people stay in these precarious job situations with the desire and hope for a better life. And this is something that Berlant terms as cruel optimism. So information precarity, again, drawing from a few of those concepts of precarity, is something that really hasn't been discussed that much in information studies. And I mentioned a couple studies there that were previous ones that brought up that term, and little engagement with these concepts that I mentioned, sort of theories such as Judith Butler's, have been brought into information studies research. And despite the calls for deeper connections with critical perspectives in library and information science research, yeah, these concepts have not been brought in. And again, this is sort of touching on a longstanding need that's been identified in information research to further question connections between power and knowledge. And it's also rooted in recognition that it's important to shift discussions around inequalities and inequities from individualized information behaviors and individual agency to address the wider structures and systems in which information practices are enacted. So information precarity as a concept, as I mentioned, hasn't been discussed in much research. There's a few studies that I mentioned here. Wall et al. Did a study of the usage of cell phones by Syrian refugees and termed information precarity as something unstable and insecure, referring to unstable and insecure access to both public and personal information. So that concept of it being both public and personal, I think, is quite interesting. It involves everything from unreliable technology access on the individual level to lack of control over situational narratives and the ability to sort of share information about your own life in public ways, and also to receive public information. Anne-Marie Lloyd in 2020 discussed information precarity a little bit and drew probably the only earlier study to sort of draw from the work of Judith Butler and also built from Wall et al. To discuss information precarity as resulting from an intensification of situations and or from information insecurity and uncertainty arising from various disjunctures. And this was referring in particular to research around the settlement process. Technology and online spaces were seen as both enabling and constraining rebuilding of information landscapes and information literacies. So, and I'll just briefly touch on some of these. So while information precarity as a concept hasn't been explored very much in information research, there are some important aspects of research that overlap with conceptions of precarity. I think perhaps most importantly, the work of Elfrida Chapman and information poverty concepts, which overlap with concepts of precarity, particularly relating to the influence of social norms and how they enable, constrain, and perpetuate various information practices. And also quite important, I think, is the concept of information marginalization, which intersects a lot with information precarity, both conceptually and, as we'll discuss in some of the research that we've done. And particularly this view on information marginalization that shifts the focus from individual views of information behavior toward broader processes that create inequities and poverties of information. So these just list in this table, and I won't go too deep into all of them, but some of the concepts from the precarity related information literature, and I'll discuss how that connects with precarity as a concept from outside of that. So we see this unstable, insecure information sources and access to information, things like information overload, information marginalization, as I just discussed, and things like stress and uncertainty and the fracturing of information literacies and landscapes. So, and there's a lot of text on this slide, but I highlighted in the yellow this is one way to sort of define from all of these concepts what information precarity could be. So information precarity could be understood as unstable, insecure, and undependable access to and literacies of information affecting social, political, legal, and economic status, and the general well-being of groups and individuals. So drawing from this idea of precarity as something that can be politically, economically, legally, or socially induced, and causing these ruptures in or heightening of levels of precariousness, and how those lead to marginalization and inequality. So to summarize how this concept has been discussed and conceived, information precarity as a concept can be sort of viewed as highlighting the relational aspects of information practices. So the way that these practices rely on and exist through relations with others and with systems in which people operate, the need for others, and how the disruption of various relations between others and between systems and people interrupts or constrains or disrupts information practices. It also emphasizes how information practices may be inseparable from those structures and from the norms in which they are enacted and performed. And in their relationality, they can be seen as always multiple things, as it's not a linear process, as something that is both performed and enacted individually, but as I mentioned, inseparable from the various elements and relations in a situation. So as something both resulting from those structures and as also always involving individual agency and the creation of new affordances to manage and make do in various situations. And so as I shift into Rebecca's discussions of our research, I wanted to sort of touch on these three broad themes that have come out of our research and connect those to these concepts of precarity. So we've discussed isolated information environments, individualized information practices, and immobilized information practices as resulting from these conditions of precarity. And in isolating information practices, that this sort of relates to these ideas of marginalization and making lives more vulnerable or less livable, as discussed by people like Butler that I mentioned earlier. Individualized practices, again, we see the shifting of focus onto individualized agency and away from an understanding of shared vulnerability and relationality, relating to some of those concepts I discussed from Isabel Laurie and the idea of precarization. And the way that information practices are immobilized can relate to this idea of how people can become stuck or stay in difficult situations, perhaps even not even being fully aware of the problems that they're facing, and this sort of broadening of precarity to be an everyday aspect of life. And so I will shift over to Rebecca.
Thank you so much. So that hopefully gave you a good sense of what information precarity is. And then we're going to talk about information precarity in academic work. And this actually came out of my PhD studies. I was looking at new academics. And as I was talking to them and hearing their experiences, it became very clear that there was sort of this underclass of other academics, and a lot of people had experienced this really difficult situation, despite being very educated, despite working in universities. But there was definitely something that was really important to explore there. So if you can forward the slide, we're going to do this with Owen's slide, so you might hear me say that a fair amount. So to give some background about the empirical work that we've done, there is increasing recognition that within higher education, there are significant inequalities, particularly for those who are early career academics, which we abbreviate as ECAs, as well as contract academic staff, so people who are working on short-term contracts, either teaching or research contracts, or sometimes both. And of course, unsurprisingly, all of these inequalities were exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. It just became very obvious where there were these inequalities. But something that is important to note, now, of course, I don't have numbers from around the world, and I'd be very interested to hear if India is having a similar kind of experience, but academic employment is increasingly casualized. There are fewer and fewer full-time continuing positions. So both within the United Kingdom and Canada, about 29% of academics are working on these short-term contracts. In Australia, it's 37% of academics, although I was chatting to an Australian who said that that's underreported because, of course, these groups are very hard to contact and as well to count accurately. But most disturbingly, in the United States, 68% of academics are working on short-term contracts. And you'll notice that there's lots of different terms used for people. Sometimes people call them casual academics, sometimes sessionals, adjunct faculty, contingency faculty, part-time faculty. Different countries have different names, but a lot of them, this is the group that we're talking about here. you could, great. So academics are already, as most of you probably will know, already deal with multiple sources of precarity and uncertainty. But this group deal with so much more of this. So most of them deal with job instability, unpredictable finances, so not being able to count on having work that will pay your bills, insecure housing because, of course, not having secure finances. So on top of all of the challenges that are typically within academia, they experience this as well. They are often also marginalized within universities. So things like they're not included in meetings. Now, this is typically because they are not paid to be in meetings, but that actually puts them in a difficult spot where it would be helpful often for them to go to meetings, to hear what's happening, to be a part of an academic department or an academic unit. But they're not part of the meetings. That means they're also not part of decision making. And often this means they don't have access to the same resources. Some of this is information from the university, but this can also be things, of course, like not having access to funds or professional development opportunities, those types of things. And contract academic staff, are particularly prevented from working to full capacity. So this is one of those things where often they are very dedicated, they are very good at their jobs, but often simply because of the situation they're in, they're not able to work to full capacity. Thanks. So universities, as we all know, are very complex and they're information-intensive environments. You have to know about your content area, you have to know about teaching and research, all the policies and procedures, as well as the large number of complex information systems that we deal with. Things like reimbursement systems, our teaching, our learning management systems, all kinds of different things. All of this sort of rolls together to make this a challenging environment at times to work in. So early career academics and contract academic staff can experience information problems within this. So we know that they have that lack of information, often that they are not at the table, they're not given information, and there's often problems with communication. They're often left off of email chains. So if something happens in the university or in the department, the school, it's not, they don't get that information. They're often excluded from workplace communications and that decision-making as discussed, which means that they're socially isolated. And that can be a very challenging aspect. Academics acquire much of the necessary workplace information through talking and sharing with their colleagues. And we know this from previous research that, you can put all kinds of things up online and have all kinds of, websites and things, but when people have questions, they tend to go to their colleagues for that information. And of course, if you are socially isolated, that makes things so much more difficult. Thanks. So uncertainty can come from, and this is sort of how information science has typically looked at uncertainty, as this sort of a lack of understanding, a gap in meaning, or a limited construct, sort of this small gap uncertainty in people's sort of everyday processes. But the implication there then is that you can just get some more information and you can bridge that gap and you'll be able to solve whatever issue you have. However, uncertainty can come from unstable, unresolved, and ongoing situations. So when information is precarious, when people are in precarious situations, this does not just allow a small bit of information to bridge a gap. So that kind of experience leads to marginalization and makes people more vulnerable. And so that's really sort of the background to what we're going to be talking about in terms of the studies that we did. So there are 3 studies. So I'm not going to go into the details of how I carried them out, but I'm happy to talk about methods or data analysis or any of those things within that. But the first study, study 1, was focus groups that I did with contract academic staff in the UK, both in England and in Scotland. The second study was interviews with early career academics, and some of them had permanent jobs, but the vast majority of them were early career researchers and postdocs who had short-term contracts. I think I only had two who were full-time. And this was during COVID. So obviously that heightened uncertainty, and they came from multiple countries: Canada, Australia, the US, the UK, South Africa. I believe those were the countries. And then I also, and this is a study that Owen was involved in as well, doing interviews with contract academic staff members in Canada. So those are the three studies. So now I'm going to talk about findings, and the way that I'm going to sort of set this up is I'm going to give you a quote that's representative about related to the theme, related to the finding, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. But these are all findings from one of the three studies that should hopefully give you a good sense of what does information precarity look like within higher education. So the first and I'm going to relate this to those three themes. So the first theme is around being isolated, and it's entitled Working in a Silo. So what I've done is we've given all of these people pseudonyms. So this is not their real name, but just a little bit. So this is Zayden, who's a contract academic staff member in Canada. So the quote is, "I feel like I'm in a bit of a silo. I think sessionals are siloed from each other as well. I don't know another single sessional teacher at their institution, but I'm sure that there are tons of us teaching the same freaking class, and I don't know who they are. It's sad. I feel sad about being disconnected from others, and it's as if my training and my career trajectory doesn't matter to the institution. They just want me to show up in the classroom and teach that class because they need to fill that position. Beyond that, I feel like they don't care much about me as a professional or a person." So in terms of working in a silo, people are often who are in precarious situations they often feel that they are isolated, that they are cut off from everyone else. And part of this is because they're not part of the normal structures that universities set up. So that isolation that they experience can be social, so cut off from their colleagues, and that can be experienced at that individual level, the collegial level, as well as institutional levels, that they're not part of the department or they're not part of the faculty or the larger university. But it can also be physical, and that physical isolation absolutely disrupts workplace information exchanges. So lots of people talked about things like not having an office. So then if you don't have an office, that's hard to do your job, but it's also then hard. You don't have a next door neighbor. You don't have someone that you can go and talk with. You're not really a part of the department. So those information exchanges with peers are so important, and that's what that physical space offers. And so this really adds to that feeling of isolation. And information provisions, so what universities will offer for contract academic staff did not always take into account what information they actually needed, particularly the practical aspects of their work. And that's a lot of what your peers will offer you. So what is the code for the photocopier? Who do I talk to about getting X or Y or Z done? And so those things are often what's missing. So when we think about isolated information environments, and of course, we're always thinking about this from an information point of view, contract academic staff report feeling not valued and of lower status than full-time colleagues. And part of this is that being isolated and not provided with the necessary information. They're not a part of things. And so that automatically leads, or that typically leads to feelings of being devalued. So institutional actions create that information poverty, that people do not have the information they need. However, with those situations, these poverties are potentially unacknowledged because they're contract workers. They're gone in a couple months, and what they experience is often unacknowledged and invisible, which means that that there's furthering information marginalization. So recognizing that this is not just about them lacking information, but this is also institutions creating situations in which people are held in these situations where they do not know and are not able to get out of them. So the next area I want to talk about is individualized information practices. And I've entitled this one, Scrabbling for Practical Information. This was something that came up over and over again. So this is Anne, who was a contract academic staff member in the UK. And she said, it took us probably 4 months to figure out which template to fill in. She was talking about a work holiday. So she was trying to fill out when she was going to take off from the university. So it took about 4 months to figure out which template we should fill in because we kept emailing to people who are responsible for it and asking. So it's not only that there's no induction or orientation and no training on how these things are to be done, but when you request information, it's also quite challenging to get answers. If you wouldn't mind. Great. So scrabbling for practical information was one of those things that happened over and over again. So people would be held up, unable to do their job simply because they lacked a small piece of practical information, like how do you fill out the form so that you can take your holidays? And it's important to recognize that contract academic staff members have significant and varied information needs. So there's a lot of things that, despite being intelligent, well-educated, and competent people, that it's quite challenging for them to do. And a lot of it is that practical side of things. So they may know their content area really well, but they may not know how to post grades online. So and it's important to recognize that these information needs are created by the situation, and this influences how they look for information as well as how they experience the world. So again, these information needs are often practical, and they're often needing information about things like contracts. And because they have contracts at maybe multiple universities, contract begin and end, they actually have increased information needs around those things. It is quite challenging to be able to know things like what benefits do I have, what pay, when do things start and stop. And so they're dealing with all of this practical information, not just from their job, but also related to their contract as well. And so not having induction, not being provided information from the university, not knowing where to find information or who to talk to, often puts people in this very challenging position where, and I've turned it scrabbling, that they're looking for things but are having a very hard time finding what they need. And this information seeking that they do happens in fits and starts, where they're often looking for things, they have to leave it and come back because things are unfinished. And that, of course, puts an increased challenge to what they're doing. So again, thinking about individualized information practices, this one is called Constantly Chasing Up and Staying on Top. And this is Jonathan, who was a contract academic staff member, a postdoctoral fellow from the UK. And he said, you have to just chase it every time you renew or get a new contract. If you were a full-time permanent member of staff, once you were set up, that would be you until something big changed. But for us, it's every time a project comes to an end. And so this quote just really highlighted that, yes, information needs fluctuate over time, but they often recur contract to contract. And often there's not someone there to help them out during that period of time to kind of get settled. So it's up to the individual to constantly chase up and to stay on top of what they need to know. So they have to actively monitor and seek out information in case something comes up that they need. So they have to look for new work. So, one contract is going to end in 3 months, so they better have a new contract lined up. So in job seeking, they also, when a new contract starts, there's all of that paperwork that has to be filled out, and there's often a lot of bureaucratic needs that have to be met. And they have to do that iteratively. So, if something pops up, they don't have the proper documentation for that, I'm going to have to stay on top of that to make sure that they get paid, make sure that the contract goes ahead. And this particularly was important for academics who were from overseas. So international people had to also think about, does this meet my visa requirements? What's going to happen with that? There's also the need to stay on top of and to manage the information. So keeping track of what information do I have? What documents do I have? What do I need? What have I given them for practical purposes, for audit purposes, as well as for legal purposes, particularly, as I mentioned, for those international professors. So, and that learning that they had was definitely applied to subsequent contracts. So that was, of course, a good thing that they figured out, okay, here's what I generally need, but you still have to be constantly up on top of things, which of course means that you have less time and energy for the job that you were actually hired to do. So thinking about individualized information practices, it's this burden of workplace information. So what do you need to know about the university, your department, your school, the job? That burden is shifted from institutions who should be, inducting people into what they need to know over to the workers, that they are having to do this themselves because things are not set up to consider what they might need. So that increased information work that they have to do to find and understand things compounds with other forms of under and uncompensated work that is associated with their contracts. So it's often, there's a lot of things that you're sort of required to do to be, a good teacher, a good researcher, that you're not necessarily being paid for. And this is one more thing on top of it that you need to stay on top of. So there's gradual growth in assurance and competence in navigating. So people did become much more sure of themselves. They were able to do things in a much better way. And it's also important to recognize that contract academic staff members definitely demonstrated agency. So they were able to figure things out. They often had creative workarounds. And that also not only is impressive, it's interesting to hear, how they approached the work that they needed to do, but also that it can often be easy to think of them as being in deficit, that they don't know these things, they don't know how to do these things. But often, it's useful to think of them as also being able to do so many things in this challenging situation. So the next theme I want to talk about is immobilized. So, and this is about uncertainty being a barrier, and a barrier in multiple ways. So this is Kara, who's a contract academic staff member from Canada. So that's pretty well 2 weeks notice that there's no teaching. So she was talking about a situation in which she was emailed and said, we were going to hire you for that teaching, but no more. So she had 2 weeks notice about that. What do I do in that situation? I think part-timers are very crafty about, always having a backup plan or being able to get a grant or find other employment or something. But with 2 weeks notice, it's just horrible. And it was almost traumatic in a way, because I was on the phone to people in the province that she lives in who are leaving for Christmas vacation. And I'm trying to find out if I even have a job to return to when I come back. It just felt so incredibly uncertain. And of course, my partner is there, picking up the emotional pieces of all that. And then there's the stress level that I think is just kind of a constant. So with this, uncertainty is a barrier in so many different ways. So not having the information needed, being in this precarious situation, means that uncertainty is a barrier to planning and decision making. If you don't know whether or not you have a job, it is extremely hard to plan and make decisions for the rest of your life. Uncertainty is also a barrier to finding the information you need. If you're in a situation where it is unclear what's going to be happening, well, what information would be helpful to look for? How could you try to mitigate that? And of course, information regarding job roles, where to find information, your status within the university, career development, all of those things become challenging to be able to look at when you're in that precarious situation. Uncertainty is also a barrier to participation. So participating in activities such as departmental meetings, university events, professional development, should you take part in it? What is your role here? Uncertainty absolutely makes that more challenging. And activities offer those opportunities to encounter information. So if you were to take part in a departmental meeting, maybe you would meet someone who you could talk to and ask them questions, but not being a part of that means that you will not encounter information, sort of run into it in that more sort of serendipitous way. And of course, then uncertainty is a source of stress and anxiety. And that's something I think that's really important to think about. It's not just people doing their job, but it impacts their levels of stress, their level of anxiety and frustration, which makes their job much more difficult to do as well. Talking about continuing on, thinking about immobilized information practices, there's also an uncertainty and this lack of investment that continued to come up. And Jill, who was a contract academic staff member in Canada, quoted, "Sometimes you don't put as much of an investment in because you don't know if you're going to be there next semester." So in this quote, she was talking about working as a teacher and just not knowing what's going to happen, so being less likely to invest. And so participants often talk about being quite reticent to invest too much time, energy, or resources into institutions that they saw as investing very little in them. So they didn't have a full-time continuing position. Do I spend that extra time creating a new class? Do I spend that extra time going above and beyond when I'm going to have to find a new job next semester? So often people adapted their information and working practices that allowed them to work in new ways, that they fulfilled their contracts because they cared about their work, but also they were working in ways that wouldn't stretch themselves too thin. There was a lot of discussions about working practices being unsustainable, that they couldn't continue to give as much of themselves in their teaching or their research because it was simply too much of the time. So individuals' information practices are rooted in and reflective of the structures and power relations. And so there was often this tension of what to do. And a lot of it was around people caring about their work. But also this, universities are not investing in me. How do I make this work? And that stress and uncertainty did definitely contribute to academics either abandoning their careers or thinking about abandoning their careers. There was much discussion of, can I actually continue on with this? And this was particularly for those people who were without secondary incomes. Some of the people that we talked to definitely had other jobs or family members who could support them. But for people who didn't have this, it was not an ongoing, sustainable situation for them. So thinking about those immobilized information practices, many of the people we talked to did feel stuck or helpless or trapped in a cycle. And this was an interesting thing because, of course, these are people who are intelligent and educated and working in universities, but that doesn't mean that they're not in a particularly precarious situation. It's also an interesting thing to think about because often we think about information as being able to solve our problems. So somebody doesn't know something, someone has an issue, let's find them the information and that will help them. But when you are trapped in a cycle of, I don't know what's going to happen, I don't know if I have a job, what does this mean for knock-on effects to my personal and professional lives? More information is often not a helpful thing. It doesn't actually solve what you need. So contract academic staff can be forced by those situations to choose either inaction or to express indifference to further engagement and information acquisition. So a lot of them started to say, I can't continue on in the way that this has been. I'm not going to be able to do these things. I can't care as much about things because of the challenges. So immobilization can be seen as a form of self-protection, to protect your time, to protect your energy, to protect your well-being. Immobilization can also be a result of information precarity, that this long time precarity further destabilizes where you are, your environment, and inhibits you from establishing connections and being able to learn to trust new sources and meet new people. So that hopefully gave you an idea of the kinds of things that we encountered, and hopefully that allowed you to see the connections between what we saw in the empirical research and this idea of information precarity related to vulnerability. So we have a few questions that we thought might inspire some conversation. Of course, we're also happy to talk about other things, but when we were thinking about this, we were thinking about what can the experiences of contract academic staff suggest about living and working in or working with precarity. And what does this suggest about vulnerability? We're also thinking about what specific elements are involved in contract academic staff members' experiences and what are their affordances. What can and should we do to improve the lives of early career academics and contract academic staff members? And what kinds of interventions would this require? And then how can we reduce information marginalization, information inequities, information vulnerabilities? And this, of course, is thinking broader. There are many, many groups of people who live in very precarious situations, and that a lot of people are experiencing this, but in different ways. Something to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca and Owen, for this wonderful talk and sharing very different angle, especially on the campus and this contract academic staff and their precarity. Now this is open for question answers. Those who have questions, please, yes, Roy Matthew, please ask your question. You have raised the hand.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson and Mr. Robertson. It was indeed an enlightening session. My question was in relation to access to research archives in particular. In India, where we have a few research archives, the very existence of these archives are not known to the public per se. Only students, or academics from noted institutions are aware of their existence. And secondary concern being that when we visit the archives, we are in many of them we are supposed to fill a form where we have to declare which institution we are from, and the way the archivist involves with us to an extent is also determined by what institution we can claim as being part of. And particularly when it comes to the archivist function as the guide to information, because as you know, information in its first sense was used in Chaucer's tales and it meant advice or guidance. So when the guide to information demonstrates a bias towards, let's say, people from certain well-established institutions, what is the workaround for that? And is there a workaround for that? Particularly in the context of archival research, where the archivist wields a very significant amount of power over who gets access to what. Because archives include things like banned texts, for example, which you cannot cite or you cannot obtain from anywhere else. That was my question.
That is a very good question. And I don't have anything particularly related to an archive, but one of the things we did find was that people's access to all kinds of things, including libraries, but also emails and anything related to a university, was often highly tied to their contract. So they'd have it for 4 months, the contract would end, and all of their email access, their library access, their everything would disappear. And this is part of the problem of that sort of you are mainly structurally invisible within the university when you are not hired. You're not a full part of things. Some people had some workarounds of trying to, when they had worked for multiple years, trying to have a contract that would be extended so that they would be hired for a full year. But that was something that was very difficult. And it's a really good point that so much of what you can do is tied to your institution. And if your institution doesn't commit to you in the same way, that you are extremely limited.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. I think we have another hand. Dr. Rakesh Kumar?
There was also a question in the chat. Said, could you please elaborate a little bit on the agency of casual academic staff? Have they been able to bring about any changes to policies, labor laws, social security measures?
That is a very good question. So part of this, well, and an interesting thing is we found a lot of our participants for the contract academic staff study through unions and faculty associations. So part of the agency that people had was individual. So they were thinking about, okay, so what is going to work for me? What do I care about? How do I set up my working life in a way that works for me, that I'd like to do more, but I can't. So what can I live with? What do I think is important? You know, collecting the information that they have that they need for themselves. Other people turn to working with unions, trying to work with others, which was an interesting thing, not always an easy thing, because so much of the issues are ongoing and long-term, and you know, you can only do so much negotiation with universities. So a lot of what was happening was individual, but a lot of people recognize the importance of working with others. But of course, when you are short-term, you are part of the union for part of the time, and then you might not be working for that university anymore, and you might not be. This is where that sort of structural ongoing issues are often coming up. I don't know if you wanted to add any more to that, Owen.
Yes.
No, I think that's great. Oh, sorry. Should...
Yeah. There is another, I think, question in chat box. Sandhya is asking, it's a real-time situation which I can relate with my challenges, which I am personally facing. My question, how better we can handle it? Kindly suggest.
That is, so when I've talked about this, I typically find there's a lot of people in the room who have had very similar experiences. This is a common thing. So a lot of, I think, what can be done to help is, now I'm thinking about this more from what would a department do to help, is to think, to have some sort of resources, and when someone starts in a department, to offer some explanation of who to go to talk to about different types of questions, and to put together sort of a list of resources for people, you know, those sort of common things that always come up. Every year when I try to post my grades, I always forget. And so I always have to go back and, you know, and to do those kinds of things. And what we found when we talked to people about their experiences, having a head of school or a, you know, a chair of a department who thought about and worked with the contract academic staff members made such a difference with that. What also could be helpful for people were having a group of people around them. So trying to find others who are in a similar situation. Often they talked about sharing an office with someone, and that they would ask the person who had been there before, you know, to kind of pool that information and try to kind of do a little bit of an induction for each other to help out. But of course, people are so busy. They're often working at multiple institutions. So this is part of this ongoing kind of intractable problem. But what we as universities need to do is think more about this group of people who we often rely on, and are so important for our teaching and our research. So I'm not sure if I have a very good answer to that, but I do think there are definitely things we can do to mitigate that.
Yes, there are lots of questions in chat box, and there is few questions in question answer box, that what would you suggest as a starting point for researching precarity and impact of precarity on contractual staff academia?
As a starting point, I mean, so this, I mentioned this came out of my just talking to early career academics. So I had talked to people who had just gotten their first full-time job, and a lot of people then started to talk about their other experiences. So I think a lot of it is getting to know the situation a little bit, kind of seeing what's there, and then looking at sort of who is not at the table and who is not being talked to. And this is a tricky thing, but when you spend some time in some of these situations, it becomes clearer of, well, no one's talking to this person. These people are talking about difficulties. So I think in any, not just within academia, you know, if you think of, you know, gig work, the sort of people being hired on things like Uber, that often their voices are not being heard. So I think that that can definitely be a place to start. But one of the real challenges is that they are hard to find. So we were very lucky that we were able to reach out to unions and to faculty associations who spread the word so that we could contact people. And actually, we had way more people who wanted to do interviews with us than we had capacity to do interviews. So people want to talk to researchers and they want to talk about their experience, but they're not always easy to find. So I think spending some time in this situation can help with that.
Yes, can we take a few more questions? Because I have one question to Owen, but related to this academic, this thing, that another question is about the misleading information, as not having access to trusted information source and even not having to check its credibility. So can you throw light on this, how to overcome this problem?
I can try to answer that. So please. So I think, I mean, relating to what we've talked about today, I guess one thing, and this is perhaps a non-answer, but perhaps flipping that to, again, to what Rebecca just mentioned of sort of understanding the situation and the broader structures within which misleading information might be shared, or where a information source and its credibility is not checked or not trusted, that not just looking at it as a individualized behavior, but sort of understanding the wider context of that. And I think that is important always to excuse me, to emphasize. And so where we're trying to move away from sort of a deficit-based perspective on that. So
yeah. Right. So one more question to Owen, that about, I'm curious to know about your PhD studies, what you are doing in this connection, because you are from music and sound. So just can you tell us about that?
sure. Yeah, it maybe doesn't immediately seem like it's connected to these ideas of information precarity. I'm studying scientific knowledge production through sound. So how the information practices of people that do environmental sound recording. So that's things like recording the sounds of birds or whales or forest ecosystems, things like that. To relate it to information precarity, I do think these concepts of kind of it being important to look at, as I just sort of mentioned, the broader situations and structures in which information practices occur and are enacted is directly related to that. And this research that I'm doing around environmental sound recordists is also related to their work in the face of global climate emergencies. So there is this broader, perhaps the more existential precarity of how research occurs within these discourses of climate disaster emergency. And I think that does relate in these ways, and it brings in these concepts of needing to look at both the structures in which information practices occur and then also the individual behaviors and how people sort of react to those.
Okay, thank you so much. It's very different kind of studies and good to, I will keep watch on your papers and publications, very interesting one. There are some lot of questions in chat box. I don't know how much time you have, because what Rebecca talked about, it's a very topic is very, very related to all academicians and all of them. So many of them are on contractual basis, and many of these kind of questions they have. So one or two questions I will take, and maybe how to overcome the insecurity of losing job due to political pressure, or through anyone raises a voice, a person has to face a lot of problems. Please guide. How can we tackle this problem? Padmashri is asking this question.
This is a really interesting and challenging thing. One of the things that we didn't sort of highlight as much, but we definitely saw in the research is that a lot of people decide not to speak out, that they think about the protection of their job as being really important, and so choose actively to not discuss things politically, to sort of just show up and do their job, not rock the boat, and make sure that they can still come back for another contract, which doesn't sit well with a lot of people, but it's sort of this built out of necessity that this is happening. So in terms of the insecurity of losing a job, I don't think I have any very good suggestions or advice. This is just something that people are becoming more aware of, thinking about how to prevent losing jobs. And this is something, I mean, you can think about it in terms of labor, you know, the need to have collective action around these things, but that's not an easy thing to deal with as an individual.
Yeah, right.
I would also just, I guess, add that the emphasis, or we saw how important in the interviews with casual academic staff, interpersonal information was, and so gathering and sort of this idea that perhaps the more isolated people are, the less they are able to cope with those situations, including losing a job, where if they have community, whether it's a part of a union or even just more interaction with other staff, they're perhaps more implicated in those in their situations and less removed from that, which may help.
Yeah, right. One question by Dr. Rakesh Kumar, who raised the hand. How is the framework of universities to overcome such concerns? University framework should be how it should be.
That is an excellent question. So what we found so much with our research was that individual departments really varied in people's experiences. So that, yes, that some people did a great job of thinking about these people, hiring these people. We also, and we haven't fully analyzed this data yet, but we also talked to heads of school or chairs of departments. So this is also something we've been thinking about, but it was so individualized that you have someone in place in a position of authority who thinks about these people and you know, helps them, and they have a much better experience. But what a lot of people talked about was that they were often hired semester to semester. So they'd have a job from September to December, and then they wouldn't have a job. And then January to April, they had another job, and they typically were hired, you know, multiple years in a row. But what people said was that if they could just be guaranteed a job for the year, so they always got lots of teaching, and if they could build contracts in that gave them that year of security, that this would make such a difference. And what was interesting, we interviewed 2 people. We had just put out the call to say, anyone who's on a short-term contract, you know, we want to interview you. And then some people were on a 4-month contract, but we had 2 people who were on 3-year contracts who wanted who volunteered to interview. And their experience was so different that just by having that bit of security, they tended to be involved in departments. One of them was actually a head of a small area, developed new things, invited to meetings, and that, you know, it was so much better in terms of what was happening. So I think what we need to do is have a shift of not allowing people to be hired 4 months at a time and hiring them year after year, but shifting into contracts that sort of allow them a little bit more stability, even if we're not hiring them on a full-time basis. I think for me, that's one of the major things, but I think there has to be and as more people are in these positions, they need to be heard more, and we need to be thinking more about that.
Yeah, I think many questions are coming in. So if you check question and answer box, I think we'll take 1 or 2 of them and then stop. did you find any relation between poverty and information scarcity? Information poverty and scarcity of information.
That's an interesting question. I don't think, well, we weren't looking specifically for that. We had a very interesting problem. This actually happened a lot when I was talking to people during the pandemic, where that there was a lot of people who didn't know what was happening, but actually at this point we had too much information, that there was an overload, but that it wasn't useful for their situation. So this is really, you can absolutely see instances where there was a scarcity of information about their particular, often around things like contracts and, you know, that they really did not have the information they needed. But sometimes they were simply overwhelmed with information that wasn't relevant to them. I talked to a lot of postdocs and they weren't teaching, and all the information that was coming out during the pandemic was what to do with your class, what to do about teaching. And they were concerned with things like their visa running out because they're on a 2-year postdoc position. And so they were often, there was so much information, but just so much irrelevant information. So scarcity is absolutely a problem, but also too much information. And this is where there's this real challenge of, if no one's thinking about this group of people and no one's thinking about what do they actually need, it becomes really difficult.
Yes, and there was one question about information, gender inequality, and about marginalized groups. What I think Owen talked about precarity and information precarity and definition he gave, I think it was related to that, but it's like how to overcome gender inequality in marginalized group. Can you shed light on this?
So yeah, why don't you take this one, Owen?
I mean, that's a big question.
I know.
I would say, but it's important. Yeah, I think, let's see, maybe, you know, to bring it back to information precarity, I guess it's, maybe I'm repeating myself with that, but it's important to emphasize the local situations of people. So I guess what's nice about some of those concepts of precarity that I discussed is that they're not attempting to universalize what that means. So it's attempting to understand how, through various, whether it's social, political, economic, gender-based inequalities, how people's lives are made more precarious, and that how that precarity leads to various inequities. So I think from an information standpoint, bring it to that, there are ways to also understand how the ways people are getting information or seeking information, their information practices are also impacted by that, and how specific, if we can focus on specific aspects of that, I think that is one small way that we could address that.
We also conducted a scoping review of empirical research that actually talked to academics on short-term contracts. There's actually not as much as you would think out there. Lots of people talking about the problem, but not necessarily talking to the people experiencing it. And one of the findings was that, and this is from a Western, we were looking at Western literature, that essentially, you know, women are more likely to be working in these short-term contracts, and people of color as well. And that, you know, simply, and awareness is not enough, but being aware that women are often sort of being pushed into these roles. A lot of, I've also talked to women who were on maternity leave and often wanted more flexibility in their work after they came back. And not always are universities open to things like that. So they decided, you know, to go to part-time or to work, you know, sort of more on contract. And so I think recognizing the systemic inequity, but recognizing that this is more likely to be happening, so that we need then to look at this and make sure that we're not perpetuating it. That is not an easy thing, but that sort of awareness is a first step.
Thank you so much. I think we have to stop. It is already over time for you. Time is really, it was a good session, excellent. And this is very different topic we have touched upon today. And I just want to thank to all of you. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Owen. And thanks to our university authorities. Thanks to University of Hyderabad. And thanks to Pramod and his team, and especially UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Study, University of Hyderabad. And thanks to Anna, who has joined as a faculty member, faculty fellow of UNESCO Chair, and she always encourages to organize such sessions. Thanks to team at UH, and thanks to all team members at Center for Publication Ethics for arranging this, doing some trial sessions, and they were very tense that if something happened, if internet goes off, and what will happen. So all alternate arrangement they did, and time management also they did it very well. So especially thanks to Preeti and Shraddha, who are organizing this workshop, this webinar. They arranged all sent links and especially circulation to many universities. They sent this message and this information about this talk. So thank you so much for this, your time, Rebecca and Owen. Thanks for your paper through which we get connected to both of you. So thank you so much. And thanks to all those who joined this webinar, even though this is some odd timing for us. Thanks for both of you for sharing your morning with us. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful to speak with people. It was great.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out and continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Some of the participants requested to have your PowerPoint presentation. Can we have it? Maybe separate, or we are sharing this video online with maybe UNESCO.
Yes, I can share the slides with you. Yeah.
Because many of them, they like this topic very much, so they requested to have. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care.
Yes, bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Pramod.
Bye.
Thank you, Pramod. Thank you, Pange sir, for joining this. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye. Preeti, you can close the session.